When the first snow fell, the neighbors scoffed at the unusual design, an odd Quonset hut cabin standing alone on the harsh, windswept plains. But by the end of the winter, they would be the ones knocking at his door, desperate to learn his secret to warmth, survival, and innovation in the unforgiving wilderness. Before we dive into this incredible story, let us know where you're watching from, and if stories like this move you, hit that subscribe button, because tomorrow's episode uncovers a hidden legend of frontier survival that will leave you speechless. The bitter winds of November had swept across the mountains, biting through even the thickest firs. As Joseph Harlan stood before his cabin site, the chill clung to his bones, making him shiver despite the layers of wool and leather wrapped around him. The small community of trappers, hunters, and settlers who lived along the edge of the Rockies had all gathered to see what Joseph was building this time. Most had already seen the strange, semicircular steel structure he'd chosen for his cabin, a Quonset hut, of all things. It wasn't the traditional log cabin they were used to, and that was reason enough for the whispers to start. "You're gonna freeze in there," old Tom, the village blacksmith, had muttered when Joseph first revealed his plans. The seasoned mountain man had built his own share of log cabins, knowing every trick to survive the brutal winters. He'd even offered to help Joseph, shaking his head as he looked at the strange material that would soon become Joseph's new home. But Joseph, having spent a decade out in the wilderness, was unshaken by the doubts of others. He knew the cold, he'd lived it, breathed it, and he was no stranger to the solitude it brought. The more he thought about the bitter, unrelenting winters, the more he realized that something had to change. Most cabins, built from logs stacked haphazardly together, couldn't keep out the cold. Wind howled through gaps, and the walls groaned under the strain of snow and ice. The roofs sagged, and the fires in the hearth never seemed to provide enough heat. Joseph had seen enough of it over the years, so he studied. He thought about how best to use the materials at his disposal, and how to build something that could stand against not just the wilderness, but the elements themselves. When he finally set foot inside the Quonset hut for the first time, the space felt almost too large. It was made of curved steel, with just a few windows and a heavy door that clicked shut behind him. The inside was nothing like the rough-hewn wood of traditional cabins. But it was solid. It had the potential to hold heat, something no log cabin could claim, at least not without a lot of firewood and constant effort. For the first week, the others in the settlement snickered as they watched him haul in the materials. "You'll freeze, mark my words," they said. But Joseph said nothing in return. He simply continued. His work, setting up a fireplace at one end of the Quonset hut and a solid stone foundation. The walls were lined with layers of insulation, and the curved roof would shed the snow better than any slanted structure ever could. As the days grew colder, Joseph began to settle into his new life. The fire crackled warmly, its heat filling the space. He watched the snow pile high outside, but remained snug inside. By the time the temperature dropped to 28 degrees, Joseph's cabin was holding steady at a comfortable 58 degrees, warm enough to live, work, and sleep without worrying about the biting cold. Yet when winter truly took hold, the neighbors came calling. They had built their own homes with logs and stone, expecting to tough it out like they always had. But the wind cut through the cracks in their walls, and the cold seeped in no matter how many blankets they used. Some had made the mistake of mocking Joseph's odd design, and now they were paying the price. By January, the mountain air had grown so cold that the trees seemed to crack with every gust of wind. Joseph's cabin, however, stood untouched by the winter's fury. It was as if the storm couldn't penetrate the unyielding steel of the Quonset hut. Inside, Joseph sat by the fire, a warm mug of tea in hand, watching the snow fall outside in soft swirls. The fire had become his only companion, its gentle warmth lapping at his face as he readied himself for the day ahead. The others were not so lucky. Every few days, someone from the neighboring cabins would arrive at Joseph's door. Their clothes were caked with snow, their faces pale from the cold, and their spirits drained from the constant battle against the elements. They had heard the rumors of Joseph's warmth, and now they wanted to know how he had done it. What was his secret? One evening, when Joseph opened his door to find Will Thompson, a young trapper from the nearby settlement, standing in the snow, he couldn't help but feel a pang of satisfaction. Will had been one of the most vocal critics of Joseph's unorthodox cabin. Now he was shivering in the cold, looking for answers. "Joseph," Will said, his breath visible in the frigid air, "I can't take it anymore. The cold's too much. Your cabin, how are you keeping it so warm?" Joseph invited him in, and Will stepped through the threshold, his eyes wide as he took in the cozy interior. The fire crackled merrily in the hearth, the warmth almost palpable as it spread through the space. It was a stark contrast to the freezing winds howling outside, and Will's eyes darted around as if he expected the warmth to evaporate into the air. "Well?" Will asked, shaking snow from his hair and looking at Joseph with wide eyes. "How?" Joseph smiled softly, knowing the answer would be as simple as it was revolutionary. "It's about understanding how heat behaves, Will, and more importantly, how to build for the cold." Joseph stood moving toward the center of the room. This Quonset hut, its shape, its insulation, the way the roof sheds snow, these aren't just quirks. They're designed to keep heat inside. The walls trap it, and the roof makes sure no snow builds up, blocking the heat from escaping. The stone foundation holds warmth, and the fireplace is positioned just right. Will nodded slowly, still processing the idea. "But what about the materials? How'd you get everything to fit together?" Joseph shrugged. "A bit of ingenuity and a lot of trial and error. It's not fancy, but it works." "Doesn't look like much," Will muttered, still skeptical. "But damn, it's warm. You might have just saved my life." Joseph nodded, though he didn't feel the need to boast. The real reward was knowing that the others would now have a chance to survive the winter, just as he had. Before Will left, he asked if Joseph would show him how to insulate his own cabin. Joseph agreed, but he knew that it would take time. A few layers of insulation couldn't compare to the structure Joseph had crafted. It would be a slow, arduous process for them, but it was a start. As the weeks wore on, more and more of the settlers came to Joseph's cabin for advice. They were desperate for warmth, and Joseph, despite his isolation, began to share his knowledge. Little did he know, this simple act of survival and innovation would set the stage for something much bigger than just a warm cabin in the middle of nowhere. By early February, the snow had begun to accumulate in deep drifts, and the sun seemed a distant memory. Joseph's Quonset hut was the only place of warmth and refuge for miles, and the word had spread. Settlers from distant homesteads trekked through the snow, seeking advice and warmth, and with each visitor, the story of Joseph's cabin grew. The warmth inside, the solid structure, and the way it stood unshaken by the fiercest storms intrigued everyone who saw it. But as more people came to learn from him, Joseph felt the quiet peace he had grown accustomed to slipping away. The morning after Will Thompson had left, Joseph found a knock at his door again. This time it was not Will. It was a group of 3 men from the nearby logging camp. They were bundled up in furs, their cheeks red from the cold, and their eyes full of the same curiosity Joseph had seen in every other visitor. "We've heard the stories," one man said, his voice gruff. "Heard about how warm it is in here, how you've got something figured out that no one else does." Joseph hesitated. He had lived in the mountains for years, knowing the hardships of survival. He hadn't expected others to come knocking. After all, most people didn't take to new ideas so easily in these parts, but Joseph knew that survival was a shared struggle, and if he could help others, he should. "You can come in," Joseph said quietly, stepping aside to let the men enter. The men paused, taking in the warmth of the cabin, each one visibly relaxing as they stepped over the threshold. They marveled at the warmth that seemed to wrap around them like a cloak. "What's the secret?" another man asked, glancing at the stone fireplace and then at the insulated walls. Joseph smiled, though it wasn't an easy smile. It's not a secret. It's about understanding the land and working with it. Everything here is built with the cold in mind, the material, the shape, the layers. It's designed to trap heat and keep the cold out. I've just adapted it to the tools I had. The men exchanged looks, clearly impressed but still skeptical. You think we could do the same with our cabins? Joseph nodded slowly. I'm not sure you'll get the same results with logs, but it's worth trying. You have to think beyond what you know. Traditional cabins won't hold up in the long run unless you change the way you think about them. The men didn't leave immediately. They spent hours asking questions, examining the walls, the door, and the window, taking mental notes on everything Joseph had done. By the time they finally left, they were eager to try the techniques Joseph had used, though none of them knew just how much work it would take. As the days passed, Joseph's cabin became a beacon of hope. His name spread far beyond the mountains, and those who came to see him began to adopt some of his methods. At first it was just a few settlers, then a few more. Before long, the ripple effect of Joseph's cabin began to spread across the region. What had started as one man's survival experiment was turning into a movement of sorts. Joseph had never intended for this to happen. He had built the cabin for himself, to stay warm, to survive the winter. But now, as others began to adopt his methods, he realized that his quiet little home was no longer just his own. It was a symbol of innovation, of ingenuity, and of the will to adapt. And even though Joseph's neighbors had once laughed at him, they were now the ones asking for his help, desperate to make their own homes survive the bitter cold. As February gave way to March, the temperature began to shift, but not enough to make Joseph's Quonset hut any less of a sanctuary. The once skeptical neighbors, now humbled by their own struggles with the cold, began to incorporate some of Joseph's methods into their homes. Some added insulation, others reinforced their roofs with thicker layers, and a few even adopted Joseph's unique foundation design. Still, they couldn't help but wonder if Joseph's cabin could truly hold up to the challenge of an entire winter. One evening, when Joseph was finishing his evening meal by the fire, a loud knock came at the door. He wasn't surprised to see the familiar faces of Will and two other men standing in the snow, their eyes filled with urgency. "Joseph," Will said, his breath fogging in the cold, "you need to come with us. There's been an accident." Joseph rose, grabbing his coat and stepping outside, following the men through the deep snow. They walked for several miles before reaching the logging camp, where the men had been working for weeks, trying to prepare for spring. When Joseph arrived, he saw a scene of chaos. The cabin at the far end of the camp had collapsed under the weight of the snow. It wasn't just the weight of the snow, one of the men explained as Joseph surveyed the damage. The roof was weak, the walls couldn't hold up, and the whole thing just buckled. Joseph stood in front of the collapsed cabin, his mind racing. It was clear that the weight of the snow had done what the cold couldn't, found the weak points in the structure and exploited them. The same thing could have happened to his own cabin had he not thought ahead, had he not used every possible means of protection. His walls were strong, his roof resilient, and he knew it could withstand even the worst the winter could throw at it. As the men discussed what to do next, Joseph turned to Will. "We need to rebuild this cabin, and we need to do it right. We'll reinforce the roof, insulate the walls, and make sure it's ready for whatever's coming next." The rebuilding process was long and arduous. The men worked day and night, hauling new logs, cutting and shaping them, and using Joseph's design principles to create a structure that would last. For the first time, Joseph realized how much he had learned in the past few months. His knowledge of construction had grown from a simple solution to a matter of life and death. By the time the cabin was finally finished, the men were exhausted but proud. The roof was reinforced with multiple layers of wood and insulation. The walls were strong, and the door was built with Joseph's techniques. As Joseph stepped back to admire the work, He knew this was more than just a cabin. It was a testament to the survival of the people who had helped build it and to the ideas that had begun to change the way they thought about the wilderness. For Joseph, the test had been passed. His cabin had weathered the worst winter could throw at it, and now it had helped others do the same. The strength of the Quonset hut and the lessons it taught had been proven in ways Joseph had never imagined. And as he stood with his neighbors, watching the sun set behind the mountains, he knew the journey was far from over. The winter might be coming to an end, but the legacy of innovation was just beginning. As the winter months dragged on, Joseph found himself in an unusual position. His cabin, once the subject of ridicule, had become the heart of the small community. Every day, more people came to seek his wisdom. Some were still skeptical, their doubts ingrained by tradition, while others were eager to learn, desperate for any method that could keep their homes standing through the bitter months. Joseph didn't mind sharing what he had learned, but the constant flow of visitors began to wear on him. The tranquility of his solitary life was fading, replaced by a steady stream of curious onlookers. There was a moment one morning when he was shoveling snow from the cabin's roof that he wondered if he had made a mistake in allowing so many to intrude on his space. "Joseph!" came a voice from behind, cutting through the stillness of the morning. Joseph turned to see a man from the nearby settlement, his face flushed with the cold. "You've got to come see this. It's bad, really bad." Without a word, Joseph followed the man, his boots crunching against the snow as they walked briskly toward the settlement. When they arrived at the cabin in question, Joseph's heart sank. The structure had been weakened by the relentless winter winds, and the roof had collapsed under the weight of the snow. It was the same problem he had warned about months earlier. The roof had not been reinforced, the insulation was inadequate, and now the damage was irreparable. "This is it, the man said, shaking his head. "We don't have enough materials to fix it." Joseph looked at the damage, his mind already racing. He had warned them time and time again that their homes wouldn't survive another brutal winter unless they made real changes. Yet many had chosen to rely on the same old methods, believing that tradition was enough to stand against the unforgiving elements. They had placed too much faith in the old ways that had served them well, but only up to a point. The cold truth was that survival depended on innovation, not just stubbornness. "We need to move quickly," Joseph said, his voice steady despite the tension in the air. "The next storm could be worse. Let's start clearing the debris, and we'll figure out a plan from there." The next few hours were filled with hard work as Joseph and the others began to clear the remains of the collapsed cabin. As they worked, Joseph could feel the weight of the situation pressing down on him. The damage wasn't just physical. It was a reminder of how stubborn people could be when it came to change. They had ignored the signs, and now they were paying the price. As the day wore on, Joseph's thoughts lingered on the cabin he had built. His Quonset hut had withstood everything the mountains had thrown at it. It had not only kept him safe, but had provided warmth and shelter for those who had come to learn from him. Yet, as the days grew colder, he couldn't shake the feeling that something more needed to be done. He had created a solution, but it wasn't enough to save everyone. The truth was simple. Not all cabins were built like his, and not all people were willing to take the leap of faith required to change. As night fell and the wind picked up, Joseph sat alone in his cabin, reflecting on the events of the day. He had given so much of himself to helping others, but the truth was undeniable. He couldn't save them all. The winter was far from over, and Joseph's resolve was being tested in ways he hadn't anticipated. But he knew one thing for sure. If survival depended on innovation, he would continue pushing the boundaries. He just hoped others would be willing to follow. The days that followed the cabin collapse were some of the longest Joseph had ever faced. The repairs were grueling, and the settlement was full of anxiety as the storms raged on. The neighbors who had once mocked his Quonset hut now saw its value more clearly than ever. But Joseph could feel the weight of their newfound respect pressing on him. They weren't just looking for guidance, they were relying on him. In the weeks that followed, Joseph doubled down on his mission. He worked tirelessly with the settlers, teaching them everything he knew about building sturdy, efficient homes in the wilderness. He shared his knowledge freely, from the importance of insulating every crack and crevice to the way the structure of the roof could make or break a cabin's survival rate. Each lesson was a small victory, and yet Joseph found himself growing weary. It wasn't the physical work that tired him, but the emotional toll of seeing his neighbors struggle and fail. One afternoon, as Joseph was making his way back to his cabin after a long day of work, he noticed a small group gathered outside his door. They were the same men who had come to him in the early days, desperate to learn. Their faces were grim, their eyes full of concern. "We need your help," Will Thompson said, stepping forward. "There's a new storm coming, and we're not sure we're ready. We need more than just advice. We need the right tools, the right materials. Your cabin, it's different. We know it's worked, but we don't know how to replicate it." Joseph stood there for a moment, looking at the group. He could see the desperation in their eyes, the fear of what was to come. They had learned what they could from him, but they still didn't fully understand the depth of the challenge they faced. The wind howled in the distance, a reminder that nature wasn't interested in their plans or preparations. It was going to do what it always did, push them to their limits and beyond. Joseph knew he couldn't carry them all. He couldn't rebuild every cabin in the settlement or teach every man to be a master builder, but he could do one thing. He could inspire them to take the next step, to push beyond their fears and traditions and embrace the future. "I can't do it for you," Joseph said quietly, "but I can help you get started. We'll take what I've learned and we'll build together. It's not just about the materials, it's about the mindset. You have to want this. You have to believe that it's possible." The men nodded, their resolve hardening. They had come to Joseph for answers, and now they understood that the true answer lay not in a single solution, but in their willingness to adapt. As Joseph turned to enter his cabin, the wind picking up once more, he realized that this was the turning point. The storm was coming, and it was going to test them all. But for the first time in months, Joseph felt something he hadn't in a long while: hope. The cold truth was that survival depended on more than just innovation. It depended on the strength of the community, on their willingness to work together and push through the hardships ahead. And for the first time in a long time, Joseph believed they could do it. The morning the storm hit, Joseph knew it wasn't going to be like any of the others. The winds howled with an intensity that rattled the walls of his Quonset hut. The sky, usually a dull gray during the winter months, had turned an ominous shade of black, casting an unnatural pall over the snow-covered landscape. It wasn't just snow that fell this time. It was a blinding, driving force that seemed to want to bury everything in its path. Joseph stood at the window, watching the first few flakes swirl into the air, his breath fogging the glass as the wind picked up, screeching through the trees. The settlement had prepared for the storm as best as they could. The men had fortified their homes, reinforced their roofs, and added layers of insulation. But even with all the precautions, Joseph could feel the weight of the storm pressing down on them. There was no escaping the power of nature when it unleashed its fury. As the storm intensified, the temperature plummeted, dropping to dangerous lows. Joseph's cabin was warm, as always, but he knew there were others in the settlement who were not so lucky. His neighbors had worked tirelessly to implement some of the methods he had taught them, but the true test was still ahead. The storm would show them whether their efforts had been enough. By midday, the winds had reached a deafening roar, and the snow had begun to pile up, covering the landscape in thick drifts. Joseph made his way through the heavy snow, determined to check on his neighbors. He had been through storms before, but there was something different about this one. It wasn't just the cold. It was the way the storm seemed to keep pushing, relentlessly battering everything in its path. When Joseph arrived at the first cabin, the scene was grim. The door had been ripped from its hinges, and the roof had collapsed under the weight of the snow. Inside, the fireplace had gone out, and the temperature had dropped to near freezing. The settlers who lived there were huddled together, wrapped in blankets, but it was clear that they wouldn't survive another night without help. Joseph moved quickly, working with the others to reinforce the cabin's frame and get the fire back going. He was methodical, calm under pressure, but inside, his mind raced. He had taught them everything he knew about building resilient cabins, but no amount of preparation could fully protect them from a storm of this magnitude. They needed more than just physical protection. They needed strength of will, determination, and a willingness to keep fighting, even when it felt like nature itself was conspiring against them. The storm raged on, its fury relentless. Joseph knew there would be more casualties if they didn't act fast, but he also knew that this was the moment that would define them. This was the test of survival that they had all been waiting for, and it wasn't just about building stronger homes. It was about whether they had the courage to face the storm head-on and keep fighting, no matter how overwhelming the odds seemed. The night was long, colder than anything Joseph had experienced in his years on the frontier. As the storm howled outside, the settlers huddled in their homes, trying to hold on to the warmth they had worked so hard to create. Joseph could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on him, the responsibility of keeping everyone safe looming over him like the storm itself. After helping to secure the last cabin, Joseph retreated to his own Quonset hut, but he couldn't shake the feeling that the worst was still ahead. He sat by the fire, watching the flames dance and crackle, but his mind was elsewhere, on the people he had helped and the storm that seemed determined to tear everything apart. Outside, the wind battered the hut, the steel walls groaning under the pressure. The snow piled up faster than he had ever seen, burying the land beneath a thick white blanket. Even his reinforced structure, which had stood strong through so many trials, seemed to shudder in the face of the storm's fury. Joseph had prepared for the cold. He had built his cabin to withstand this kind of weather, but this storm, it was different. It was like the wilderness had reached a boiling point, and nothing was going to be spared. He thought about his neighbors, those who had tried to build homes like his, but had fallen short. They had worked hard, but they were only human, and sometimes human ingenuity wasn't enough to hold back nature's wrath. As the hours passed, the storm showed no signs of letting up. Joseph spent the night checking his supplies, reinforcing his door, and making sure the fire kept burning. But even in the warmth of his cabin, he couldn't escape the gnawing worry in the pit of his stomach. What if the storm didn't stop? What if they were trapped, unable to escape, or even survive? In the midst of his worries, Joseph's thoughts turned to the people he had helped, and to the one thing that had brought him here in the first place: survival. He had built his cabin for himself, but now it had become more than just a shelter. It was a lifeline for others, a beacon of hope in the midst of chaos. But it wasn't just about surviving the storm, it was about what came after. What kind of world would they emerge into when it was all over? Would they have the strength to rebuild, to keep going, even after everything they had fought for had been tested to its limits? Joseph had spent so many years in isolation, relying only on himself. But now, as the storm raged on, he realized something profound. Survival was never just about the individual, it was about the community. It was about coming together in the face of adversity, supporting each other when everything seemed lost. And in that moment, Joseph understood that the storm, though fierce, could not break their spirit. The storm would end eventually. And when it did, Joseph would be ready to help his neighbors rebuild, not just their homes, but their belief in the power of their collective strength. The storm had passed, leaving behind a landscape that looked almost unrecognizable. The snow was deeper than ever, and the trees, once strong and proud, were bent low beneath the weight of the white blanket. The wind had ceased, and for the first time in what felt like days, The world was eerily still. The only sound was the soft creak of snow settling on rooftops. Joseph stood at the edge of his cabin, looking out over the settlement. The once strong homes had been tested, their roofs partially collapsed, doors torn off, and windows shattered. It was a grim sight, but Joseph didn't feel the despair he had expected. He had survived the storm, and more importantly, so had the others. They were battered, but they were alive. One by one, the neighbors emerged from their cabins, shaking off the snow, their faces a mixture of exhaustion and relief. They had made it through. They had all made it through. Joseph moved from cabin to cabin, checking on everyone. Some of the structures were salvageable, others not so much. But Joseph wasn't focused on the damage. Instead, he saw the determination in the eyes of his neighbors, the spark that said they weren't ready to give up yet. They were still standing, and that was all that mattered. As he walked back to his Quonset hut, Joseph felt a sense of peace settle over him. The storm had tested them all, but it had also brought them closer. It was a reminder of the strength that lay in community. They had faced the worst, and now, together, they would rebuild. The days after the storm were filled with hard work and shared determination. The damage to the settlement was extensive, but the community's spirit had been unshaken. Joseph led the charge, offering guidance and support, but it wasn't just his strength that held them together. It was the collective will of the settlers to rebuild. They worked in teams, clearing the snow, reinforcing the structures that could be saved, and starting from scratch where necessary. Joseph didn't just oversee the work. He worked alongside them, teaching them everything he knew about building sturdy homes and creating structures that could withstand nature's wrath. They learned quickly, absorbing his lessons and adapting them to their own needs. As the weeks passed, the settlement began to take shape once more. The cabins were rebuilt stronger, better insulated, and more resilient than ever before. The roof lines were reinforced, the doors stronger, and the foundations more solid. But more than the physical work, the community was rebuilding itself. The bonds between the settlers had grown stronger during the storm, and now they were putting that strength to good use. Joseph could see the change in them. They no longer looked at him with skepticism or doubt. They trusted his judgment, and more importantly, they had come to understand that survival wasn't just about building strong cabins. It was about working together and facing challenges head-on. As the first signs of spring began to emerge, Joseph stood back and looked at the settlement. It was a far cry from the place it had been before, but it was a place of hope, strength, and resilience, and that, Joseph knew, was all they needed.